Hi and welcome to this demo of the new mask from Curvature Node that is included in this last extension pack release, the extension pack 3R2 release. You can get to the mask from Curvature Node by right-clicking in the node graph and going to the layer extension pack mask from Curvature. And you're getting this node, which has quite a lot of handles. The mask from Curvature node, as the node implies, requires a baked curvature map to work. So you do need to do some baking. And for best results, I would recommend you bake a map that has both concave as well as convex edges and uses a gray midpoint. For example, a map that looks like this. Now this particular map was baked externally from a program called Mighty Bake, which is a very fast baker. I recommend you look into it if you're using a lot of bakes and a lot of UDIMs. However, with this extension pack update, the R2 update, I'm also distributing some new Modo Bake presets that will generate a curvature map that looks like this. In addition, the mask and curvature node is also designed to work off the old traditional Modo Bake curvature maps, which have a white midpoint, as we can see here. So the neutral value is white, and there's no separation between concave and convex edges. However, the node will still work, with one exception that you cannot isolate cavities. The mask and curvature node is an image processing node designed to blend together differently blurred versions of a single curvature map. So in order for that to work, you need to create, ideally, a few differently blurred versions of your original curvature. The node does work with a single curvature map as well, and we will look into that a little further on. So first things first, I'm going to attach the curvature sharp handle to my original curvature bake. And now I need to go ahead and create different blurred versions of this sharp curvature. So I can do that in Mari by duplicating the node a few times, as I've done here, and applying differently sized blurs to it. And ideally you do this in an incremental fashion, so you duplicate the node once, apply a blur, then duplicate the blurred version and apply another blur, etc. For the finer blurs, I would recommend you using the filter blur, which has a maximum radius of 10 pixels. And for the bigger blurs, I would recommend you use the Gaussian blur, which has a max radius of 50 pixels. Now it is kind of important to remember that when doing this process instead of Mari, that all the blurs are using a fixed pixel value as a maximum radius. So here, for example, a radius of 50 means that you're blurring in a radius of 50 pixels. Subsequently, if you're doing this on a map size that is 256 times 256 pixels, it's going to be quite a huge blur. If you're doing the same process with the same settings on a map size that is 8K, it's going to be quite a small blur. In order to work around that, I found that it is best to step down the map size on the paintable nodes for the larger blurs. So you can do this by double-clicking on a paintable node and then using the general tab here and then changing the size of the node. So you'll rescale the maps down to whatever size you need. Saying all that, I have found that you can do this same process a lot faster and more efficiently if you're using either Nuke or doing the same process using a Photoshop action. Photoshop also has the advantage of giving you wider blurs out of the box, so you can use a lot bigger pixel values for blurring, and you don't need to worry about stepping down the map size. You can obviously do 3D Gaussian blurs, so you could, instead of Mari, use the object generate Gaussian blur, which is a full seamless 3D blur. However, since the node blends together differently blurred versions, I have found that doing non-seamless blurs, so either inside of Mari or Photoshop or Nuke, that do cause seams on UDIM edges or on shells that have been split in the middle, I've found that it's not that much of a big deal. So for example, here we have some differently blurred versions that I already created. And now I'm going to go ahead and attach all these different blurs to the different handles of the mask and curvature node. There are some additional handles that I'm going to leave unmapped at the moment, the jitter fine and jitter coarse, but we'll tackle those in a few minutes. One additional thing before we start diving into the deeper workings of the node is the importance of the color space you're using when importing or processing maps that use a gray midpoint. As you can see inside of my viewport, my gray midpoint seems to be not quite 0.5. However, if we turn off the color management, you will see the midpoint is the correct 0.5 value. You can validate your midpoint by creating a node called gray constant, which is another extension pack node, and then just viewing that. And you can see this one is internally set to 0.5, and we're kind of in the same value range. When you first importing your curvature map that uses a gray midpoint, do make sure that your channel is set to automatic linear or just linear. The same thing if you're bringing in an image through the image manager. Make sure that this image is brought in as linear, because this is important, because a lot of the blend modes inside of Mari or in any image application work off a midpoint of 0.5 linear. So if your curvature map looks like this darker value while still having color management on, that means that you've imported as sRGB, which wouldn't be the right value. It would still work, and there are ways to work with this. However, ideally you just bring it in as linear straight away. With all of our blurred curvature maps attached, now it's time to start looking at the mask and curvature node. So I'm just going to view this, and this is what we're getting by default with this setup. Now I will talk about some of the options first, so before we get something more useful, you will have to kind of start looking or keep looking at this, which does not look that useful, but we'll get to a more advanced version in a minute. Now, as I've mentioned before, the mask and curvature mode is just a notified version of a big graph inside of Mari. So a lot of these options will be quite familiar. There's very little hardwiring or hard coding of things going on inside of the node. The node should be considered a compact version to do a lot of blending within a single node, instead of having to create, a dozen nodes or even 24 nodes inside of a node network and having to deal with different nodes. Now the first thing inside of the node is the curvature neutral group, and this one is used to determine what kind of map is attached to our handles. So you can see here the curvature neutral value. We have the gray, white, and white stages from single map. We're currently using a curvature map with a gray midpoint, so the default setting of gray is what we need. If you're using this setup with a curvature map that was baked with the default motor baked curvature, so that one uses a white midpoint as we've seen previously, then in this case you would set this to white. The third option, the white stages from a single map, is used if you're not having differently blurred versions of the original map. In this case, this node will try to create or isolate different areas of your map and try and create these different blurred versions for you. You can fine-tune these settings afterwards for the stages from a single map in the advanced options stages from a single map group. And this one shows you both the gradient width as well as all the different positions for the different kind of maps that are created. The system uses a thresholding function, so you should be quite used to it if you have used the threshold node that is part of extension pack before. You can see here it has a threshold value and an edge value. All these sliders for sharp, fine, soft, medium, etc. correspond to settings of a threshold value, and the gradient width is a collected setting for the edge setting in a thresholding function. You can also invert the positions, which will basically just flip each position to the other side. So here, for example, a value of 0.1 would become a 0.9 value. And the same for example, for the medium, for the big one, is 0.65 value would become a 0.35 value. But for now, we will keep working with this neutral value of gray. Below this dropdown, we have the offset midpoint, which, like I've said before, when you've imported by mistake a sRGB map, so with an sRGB value of 0.5, in this case, you could, for example, use the offset midpoint to kind of readjust the values internally to work with this new midpoint. You can also use the offset midpoint in a last stage after you've done a lot of the other settings to kind of fine-tune the result a little bit. The main section of the node is the curvature influence group. The curvature influence group determines the opacity that each map is blended together with. So we have the sharp, huge, large, and you can adjust kind of these settings around. And like I said, you should consider those the opacity of each map. There are a few different settings available here as well in this group. The invert result will literally invert what you're seeing on screen. And the mode determines how the processing is biased towards either edges or cavities or both. So we have the edges, we have the cavities, and we have dual. Dual will process both modes, edges and cavities, and blend them together later on. Now again, if you're using a modo bake curvature map, so one with a wide midpoint, then only the edges setting will work because there's no information to determine what is an edge or a cavity. There's also a mode called raw, and the raw mode is a special mode that only uses one blend mode to blend together all the maps, the sharp, fine, soft, medium, etc. Now, as I mentioned, this is the opacity of each map. The blend modes that each maps are blended together with are set under the curvature blending group. So you can see here the overlay is set on most of the different maps, and the big, large, and huge have different blend modes such as linear light and color burn. A lot of the blend modes are using 0.5 to determine if to darken a map underneath or lighten a map underneath. So for example, the overlay will bias towards lighten the map for values of larger than 0.5 and bias towards darkening a map underneath when the value of the map is below 0.5. Same thing with the new linear light blend mode that I added as part of extension pack R2, or 3R2 I should say, and the color burn. So you can get different effects by changing the blend modes here as well, and just experiment around with different settings. Let's change this back to color burn at the default. The next group is the spread and tightness. And those are more or less brightness and contrast functions that are being applied to the result. So you can control how far the mask goes over the surface or how sharp the mask is. We then have the advanced options input remap, and those are used to remap or adjust the maps that are fed in by these handles. So we have the map FSM blur and the map BLH blur. So the first curve affects just the maps fine blur, soft blur, and medium blur. So we can kind of apply more contrast to the maps coming in, just to reprocess them a little bit. And the same for the BLH blur, which are the big, large, and huge blurs. Now again, these are advanced options, so you don't need to adjust them if you don't have to. The next advanced options group is called blending. And this is used to affect some of the internal calculation of the node. For example, the raw blending is the blending mode that is used for all of these map blending when the mode is set to raw. We then have some different sliders and blend modes to affect how cavity is calculated, as well as how the cavity is calculated when in mode dual. And then finally the cavity and edge blending mode, which is the blend mode that is used when dual is on. So that kind of determines what blend mode the edge and the cavity calculation are blended together to make up the final dual. Especially this section is largely documented inside of the help files, so I'm not going to cover this part too much in this tutorial. If you want to know more what exactly each value does, I would refer you to the help files under the extension pack online help. One final group under the advanced options is the advanced options jitter, which brings us to one of the core functionalities of the node, that is used to break up all these edges that are not looking very exciting at the moment. On the outside of the node, you can see these two handles, jitter fine and jitter coarse. Anything that is attached to these handles will be multiplied against these sliders that you can find under the curvature influence group. The jitter fine will be multiplied against the sharp, fine, soft, and medium sliders, and the jitter coarse against the big, large, and huge sliders. The input of the handles is multiplied using the RGB values of any node that is attached to these handles. So for example, by default, the jitter fine red channel would be multiplied against the fine, the jitter fine green channel against the soft, and the jitter blue channel against the medium slider. You can change the mapping of the jitters under the advanced option jitter group, and in here, for each of the sliders, you have a drop down where you can change how it is mapped. So as I mentioned before, for example, the fine is mapped by jitter fine red. However, you can change that to, for example, use the jitter coarse red, ignore the jitter, or use different attenuated versions of this jitter. For example, a attenuated jitter fine red would multiply the result or the node that is attached on the jitter fine first against the fine map and then multiply it against the fine slider. Subsequently, the inverse attenuated jitter fine red would multiply anything that is attached to the jitter fine handle, or in that case just the red channel of what is attached to the jitter fine handle, against the inverted jitter fine, the inverted fine blur curvature map, and then multiply it against the fine slider. There's some additional attenuation value down here, which is just part of the calculation, and you can experiment around how it affects the final look. And if you want to know exactly what it is doing behind the scenes, again, I refer you to the help files. Now let's attach something to these handles and see how this affects our final outlook. You can, for example, create a simple cloud node, and let's attach this to the jitter fine. You can see how it starts to break up the edges. And remember, at the moment, the jitter fine is mapped against the sharp, fine, soft, and medium result, as you can see here. Now I'm gonna create a axis projection and drop in a map in here and attach this to the jitter coarse. Now the result is changing quite a lot. So let's go back to the mask and curvature node, and for starters, we're gonna change the spread and the tightness a little bit. Let's change the huge settings. Just play around with some of these sliders to see how it affects things. You might have to invert the map. Actually, let me undo that and go back to the original non-inverted map. So you can kind of see how this can help you break up the edges quite a lot. We could try, for example, a different mode. So let's change this to dual. I'm going to invert this here. So now we have a bit more on the flat surfaces as well. Now it kind of comes down to just playing around with some settings to find a look you like. We could change the attenuation down here. So now the big slider is going to be multiplied against, or sorry, the axis projection blue channel is going to be multiplied against the huge blur first, and then multiplied against the huge slider. Let's try this with an inverse. So now we have pretty good control over all the flat surfaces. So how much detail we want in there. We could even do a combination and do a different sized feature just for the huge slider by combining, for example, different axis projections with different sizes and combining them into multiple channels by using, for let's say, a shuffle command, and then using this to create an RGB map. Let's keep experimenting around with the edges a bit and change the cloud setting while we edit. And I'm actually going to attach this to a setup I've created before. Just to see as part of a region. Maybe change this to something more contrasty so it's easier for you to see. Let's go back to our curvature node and then just keep playing around with the settings a little bit. We could try the remap at this point. Kind of change the original maps of the BL, the big, large, and huge maps, as well as some of the fine areas, just to kind of fine tune the map size a little bit. So now we have some edge breakup, and we could go on from there. At this point, it might even be worth going back to the curvature neutral and experimenting with offsetting the midpoint, so you can see how this can act as a kind of a last step to kind of fine-tune some areas as well. It is worth mentioning that at this point, if you're happy with your overall curvature, it would be a good practice to bake this to a texture in order to not have all this blending that is happening to be live all the time while you keep painting and working on different layers of the object. So at this point, I would usually bake this down in a way that I can still access the original mask and curvature and make changes. I would utilize a system that uses a NTO skip node and a bake visible to select the paint node. So let's create the NTO skip node first and create the bake visible to select the paint node. Let's then add a paintable node. You can do this by the right mouse click, add paint node, or just pressing P, which gets you the add image set dialog, where you can choose a size and resolution bit depth for your image set. So let's add the paintable node. And the way I usually do this is I attach the NTO skip handle to the paintable node, the target to the paintable node, and the source of the bake visible to whatever I want to bake. Then attach the skip handle to the bake visible to select the paint node. Now you've basically isolated the paintable node. So in this case, the live output of the mask and curvature goes through the skip handle of the NTO skip, meaning it will not be evaluated as part of the live calculation in the viewport, but only what is attached to the non-skipping handle of the NTO skip, which in this case is the paint node. So let's hook this up to the original region mask. And now we need to bake this into the paintable node. So I'm just going to view the bake visible to select the paint node. As the node says, it bakes what is visible. And then click once on this paintable node till it gets this whiter shade, which indicates that it's the paint target. And now in the bake visible to select paint node's node properties, I've just clicked bake. And now Mari bakes this result. And now, if I go back to my full shader, I have again the result of this paintable node. And I can keep making changes and update the bake. Now you can also quite easily go back to a live view of the bake mask and curvature just by selecting the NTO skip node and utilizing the bypass option that you can find here, which is Control D. So if we do Control D, it'll cycle through the different connections of the node. So in this case, I'm on the paint node, which doesn't make any difference to before. If I press this again, now I'm on the live output again. So if I make a change to the mask and curvature, you will see that is the live output. So you can quickly, this way, make changes, go back to a live view, and then, update this again and bake it into the paintable node and have a performance-friendly version of all this stuff up here for later, just to keep using it in your workflow. So this way you're not getting bogged down by having areas of the node graph live that you might not be working on at the moment. So after this little detour into how to optimize this stuff, this pretty much concludes this tutorial, and I hope you like it. And again, it is good practice to understand the mask and curvature nodes. It's a big factor in all the edge mask presets and edge wear presets I'm distributing with this latest extension pack release. Thank you very much.